November 11th, 1918. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent across the Western Front. After 4 years of industrial slaughter, the Great War had ended. Across the muddy expanses of Flanders and northern France, soldiers emerged from their trenches into an eerie quiet, many unable to comprehend that they had survived. The silence was profound, almost sacred, yet beneath it lay the seeds of a catastrophe that would dwarf even the horror of the Somme and Verdun. Europe lay in ruins. 10 million soldiers had perished, 20 million more bore wounds that would never fully heal. Entire villages had been erased from the map. Ancient forests had been reduced to shattered stumps and poisoned earth. The Spanish influenza, carried home by demobilizing armies, would claim more lives than the war itself, but the physical devastation, terrible as it was, represented only the visible damage. The true wounds ran deeper into the foundations of civilization itself. 4 great empires had collapsed into dust. The German Kaiserreich, which had dominated Central Europe for nearly half a century, disintegrated as Kaiser Wilhelm II fled into Dutch exile. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, that sprawling multinational realm, ruled from Vienna for 600 years, splintered into a dozen quarrelling successor states. The Ottoman Empire, which had held dominion over the Middle East since the 15th century, crumbled under the weight of Arab revolt and British invasion. And Russia, where the Romanov dynasty had reigned for 3 centuries, had already descended into revolutionary chaos and civil war. Into this vacuum rushed new forces: nationalism, communism, fascism, each claiming to offer salvation from the ashes. The old order was dead, but what would replace it remained terrifyingly uncertain. In January 1919, diplomats and statesmen gathered at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris to forge a new world order. For 6 months they debated, argued and bargained. 3 men dominated the proceedings: Georges Clemenceau of France, determined to cripple Germany forever; David Lloyd George of Britain, seeking to balance revenge with pragmatism; and Woodrow Wilson of the United States, whose idealistic vision of a League of Nations seemed noble yet naive to European cynics, hardened by years of bloodshed. Germany was not invited to participate. The defeated nation could only wait, anxious and isolated, as the victors decided its fate. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, imposed conditions so harsh that even some Allied leaders blanched at their severity. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the conflict. This was not merely symbolic. It provided the legal justification for everything that followed. The reparations were staggering. Germany was ordered to pay 132 billion gold marks, a sum so astronomical that economists warned it could never be repaid without reducing the German people to permanent servitude. The Saar Basin, rich in coal, was placed under League of Nations control for 15 years. The Rhineland was to be permanently demilitarized. All of Germany's overseas colonies were confiscated and distributed among the victors. The German military was reduced to a token force, an army of 100,000 men with no tanks, no aircraft, no heavy artillery, and a navy stripped of its battleships and submarines. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating blow was territorial. Alsace-Lorraine, seized from France in 1871, was returned. Eastern territories, West Prussia, Posen, parts of Silesia, were ceded to the newly resurrected Poland, creating the infamous Polish corridor that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Danzig became a free city under League administration. Altogether, Germany lost 13% of its European territory and 10% of its population. The German delegation, when finally shown the treaty terms, was stunned. Count Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, head of the delegation, protested that these conditions would sentence millions of Germans to starvation and perpetual subjugation. His protests were ignored. Faced with the threat of renewed Allied invasion, Germany had no choice but to sign. Back in Germany, the news struck like a thunderbolt. Many Germans had believed, until the final weeks of 1918, that their nation was winning the war. The armistice had come as a shock. This treaty felt like a betrayal. How had victory been stolen from them? The answer that began to circulate, propagated by nationalist politicians and disgruntled military officers, was that Germany had been stabbed in the back. This Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth, would poison German politics for the next 2 decades. According to this narrative, the German army had never been defeated in the field. Instead, civilian politicians, socialists, and Jews had betrayed the fatherland by signing the armistice and accepting the humiliating peace terms. General Erich Ludendorff, who had wielded dictatorial power during the final years of the war before fleeing to Sweden as defeat loomed, became one of the myth's most prominent propagators. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, elevated to near-mythical status as the victor of Tannenberg, lent his prestige to the lie when he testified before the Reichstag committee investigating the war's end. The truth was quite different. By autumn 1918, Germany's military position had become hopeless. The failure of the spring offensive had exhausted the army's reserves. American troops were arriving in France at a rate of 10,000 per day. The Allied blockade had reduced Germany to near starvation. Bulgaria had collapsed, exposing the southern flank. Austria-Hungary was disintegrating. Revolution was stirring in Germany's cities and ports. Ludendorff himself had demanded an immediate armistice to prevent complete catastrophe, but truth mattered less than narrative. The stab-in-the-back myth provided a comfortable explanation for an incomprehensible defeat. It allowed German nationalism to survive intact, even strengthened, because Germany had not truly lost. It had been betrayed. This distinction would prove catastrophic. The Kaiserreich collapsed into the Weimar Republic, a democratic experiment born in chaos and forever tainted by its association with defeat and humiliation. The new government inherited not only the burden of reparations, but also the stigma of having signed the hated treaty. From its inception, the Weimar Republic faced enemies on both the radical left and the radical right, both of whom despised democracy and sought to overthrow it by any means necessary. In the chaotic streets of Munich, Berlin, and Hamburg, the future of Germany and of Europe would be decided not in parliament but through violence. In Berlin, the winter of 1918-19 witnessed a power struggle between moderate socialists and radical communists. The Spartacist League, led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, attempted to replicate Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution, calling for the overthrow of the provisional government and the establishment of a Soviet republic. The uprising was crushed in January 1919 by units of the regular army supported by Freikorps, irregular paramilitary formations composed primarily of embittered veterans who despised both communists and the new democratic government. Liebknecht and Luxemburg were arrested, beaten and murdered by Freikorps officers. Their bodies were dumped in a Berlin canal. The killers were never seriously prosecuted. This pattern, political violence from the right, met with official leniency, while left-wing agitation provoked savage repression, would characterize the entire Weimar period. The Freikorps represented a new and dangerous force in German politics. Organized along military lines, but operating outside legal constraints, these units attracted men for whom the war had become an identity rather than merely a duty. They wore their uniforms with pride, displayed their decorations openly, and spoke contemptuously of the November criminals who had supposedly betrayed Germany. When the government tried to disband them, they sometimes turned their weapons against the state itself. In March 1920, a Freikorps brigade led by Captain Hermann Erhardt marched on Berlin in an attempted coup, the Kapp Putsch. The regular army, when ordered to suppress the revolt, refused. General Hans von Seeckt, chief of the Reichswehr, delivered a devastating reply. Troops do not fire on troops. The putsch collapsed only after Berlin's workers launched a general strike that paralyzed the city, but the lesson was clear. The military would not defend the Republic from right-wing insurrection. Beyond Berlin, chaos reigned. In Bavaria, a short-lived Soviet republic was proclaimed in April 1919, before being brutally crushed by Freikorps units who executed hundreds of suspected communists. In the Rhineland, French-sponsored separatist movements attempted to create independent buffer states. In Silesia, German Freikorps and Polish irregulars fought a vicious guerrilla war over the region's future allegiance. The centre could not hold. Into this maelstrom stepped a 30-year-old Austrian veteran named Adolf Hitler. His story, though it would become the most consequential of the 20th century, began in obscurity. Born in the provincial town of Braunau am Inn in 1889, Hitler had drifted through Vienna as a failed artist before the war gave his life purpose. He served with distinction in a Bavarian regiment, earning the Iron Cross First Class, a rare honour for a corporal. The armistice, which found him recovering from a British gas attack, devastated him emotionally. Like millions of veterans, he could not accept that Germany had truly been defeated. In September 1919, while working as an army intelligence agent monitoring extremist groups in Munich, Hitler attended a meeting of a tiny organisation called the German Workers' Party. Founded by a railway locksmith named Anton Drexler, the party combined nationalist sentiment with crude anti-capitalist rhetoric. Hitler, recognizing the potential of these ideas to mobilize the masses, joined as the party's 55th member. Within 2 years, through sheer force of personality and oratorical brilliance, Hitler transformed this insignificant group into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or Nazi Party, and established himself as its undisputed leader. His speeches, delivered with hypnotic intensity in Munich's beer halls, touched something deep in the German psyche. He spoke of betrayal and redemption, humiliation and revenge, the nobility of sacrifice, and the treachery of enemies both foreign and domestic. His targets were specific and carefully chosen: the November criminals who had signed the armistice, the democratic politicians who had accepted Versailles, international bankers who supposedly profited from Germany's misery, communists who threatened German civilization, and above all, Jews, whom Hitler blamed for every calamity that had befallen Germany. This virulent anti-Semitism, though hardly unique in Europe, would eventually metastasize into the Holocaust, but in the early 1920s, it seemed to many merely an extreme version of common prejudices. The Nazi Party grew rapidly, attracting disaffected veterans, unemployed workers, and members of the lower middle class threatened by economic chaos. Hitler organized the Sturmabteilung, the SA, or Storm Detachment, a paramilitary force modelled on the Freikorps that wore brown uniforms and terrorized political opponents. The streets of German cities became battlegrounds where Nazi stormtroopers fought pitched battles against communist Red Front fighters and Republican Reichsbanner units. This political violence was not an aberration, but the essence of Weimar politics. Democracy requires a fundamental agreement that disputes will be settled through ballots rather than bullets. The major political forces of Weimar Germany rejected this compact. The communists, following Moscow's directives, viewed parliamentary democracy as a bourgeois sham to be overthrown through revolution. The Nazis despised democracy as weak and decadent, a symptom of national decline. Between these extremes, the democratic parties seemed feeble and ineffectual. The ultimate irony of the Weimar Republic was that its destruction was guaranteed by the very treaty that had created it. Versailles had saddled Germany with impossible burdens while simultaneously destroying the legitimacy of the government forced to implement the treaty's terms. Every reparations payment, every humiliation, every concession to the Allies could be blamed on the November criminals and their democratic system. The Republic's enemies were handed an inexhaustible supply of grievances. Across Germany's southern border, a parallel process was unfolding in Italy. Though technically a victor in the Great War, Italy had gained far less than promised in the secret treaties that lured it into the conflict in 1915. The acquisition of Trentino and Trieste from Austria-Hungary seemed paltry compensation for 650,000 Italian dead and a shattered economy. Nationalists spoke bitterly of a mutilated victory. Benito Mussolini, a former socialist journalist who had embraced extreme nationalism during the war, organized disaffected veterans into the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, the Italian fasces of combat, in March 1919. Like Hitler's stormtroopers, Mussolini's black shirts engaged in systematic violence against socialists, communists, and trade unionists. But whereas the Weimar authorities at least attempted to maintain order, Italian liberals actively encouraged fascist violence as a bulwark against Bolshevism. In October 1922, Mussolini organized the March on Rome, more a propaganda spectacle than a genuine military operation, but it achieved its goal. King Victor Emmanuel III, rather than ordering the army to disperse the fascists, invited Mussolini to form a government. Democracy in Italy had collapsed not through revolution, but through the cowardice of its defenders. Mussolini's success provided a template, a movement built on nationalism, violence, and contempt for democratic norms could seize power if traditional elites could be convinced that fascism was preferable to communism. This lesson was not lost on Hitler, who in November 1923 attempted his own putsch in Munich. The beer hall putsch failed. The Bavarian police fired on the marching Nazis, killing 16, and Hitler was imprisoned. But the trial gave him a national platform, and his brief incarceration allowed him to write Mein Kampf, the rambling manifesto that laid out his vision for Germany's future. The threat of Bolshevism provided the crucial justification for fascism's rise. Lenin's Bolsheviks had seized power in Russia in October 1917 and established a communist dictatorship that proclaimed world revolution as its goal. The Bolsheviks repudiated Russia's foreign debts, nationalized industry and land, executed the Tsar and his family, and launched a brutal civil war against their opponents. News of Red Terror, mass executions, concentration camps, forced requisitions that caused famine spread throughout Europe. The spectre of communism haunted the European imagination. Property owners feared expropriation. The middle classes dreaded losing their status. Nationalists saw Bolshevism as a foreign Asiatic threat to Western civilization. The Catholic Church condemned it as satanic atheism. These fears were not entirely irrational. Communist parties across Europe openly called for revolution and took their orders from Moscow's Comintern. In March 1919, communist revolutions erupted in Hungary and Bavaria. Both were quickly crushed, but their existence proved that Bolshevism was not confined to Russia. In 1920, Lenin's Red Army invaded Poland, reaching the outskirts of Warsaw before being dramatically defeated at the Battle of Warsaw, a victory that Polish propagandists called the Miracle on the Vistula. Throughout the 1920s, communist parties in Germany, France, and elsewhere organized strikes, demonstrations, and occasional uprisings. This communist threat, real and imagined, pushed much of Europe rightward. Traditional conservatives, who might have opposed fascist radicalism, concluded that Mussolini and Hitler were the lesser evil. Fascism might be crude and violent, but at least it defended private property, national sovereignty, and traditional values. Communism threatened to destroy everything. This calculation would prove catastrophically wrong, but in the unstable 1920s it seemed rational to many. The Western democracies, France, Britain, and the United States, watched these developments with alarm but did little to intervene. France, despite maintaining the largest army in Europe, was exhausted and traumatized. Britain, having lost nearly 1 million men, wanted nothing more than to return to business as usual. The United States, after the Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and membership in the League of Nations, retreated into isolationism. This failure of the democratic powers to actively support democracy in Germany and Austria proved decisive. The Weimar Republic received no meaningful assistance, no debt relief, no security guarantees, no diplomatic support. When Germany requested modifications to the reparations schedule, France responded by occupying the Ruhr in 1923, Germany's industrial heartland, to extract payments by force. This occupation further radicalized German nationalism and demonstrated that the Allies viewed Germany not as a partner in building a new Europe, but as a defeated enemy to be exploited indefinitely. The League of Nations, Wilson's great hope for preventing future wars, was crippled from birth. Without American membership, it lacked credibility and power. The Soviet Union was initially excluded as a pariah state. Germany was not admitted until 1926. The League's covenant required unanimous decisions, making effective action nearly impossible. It possessed no army and relied entirely on the dubious willingness of member states to enforce sanctions. As the 1920s progressed, it became increasingly clear that the peace settlement had resolved nothing. The borders drawn at Versailles satisfied no one and guaranteed future conflicts. Ethnic minorities trapped in the wrong countries agitated for revision. Defeated powers plotted revenge. The victors quarreled among themselves over security arrangements and debt repayments. The democratic experiment in Central Europe teetered on the brink of collapse, yet through most of the 1920s, a fragile stability prevailed, sustained not by wisdom or genuine reconciliation, but by American money. The economic catastrophe of the early post-war years gave way to a boom fueled by dollars flowing from Wall Street to rebuild Europe. This prosperity was artificial, built on unsustainable debt, but while it lasted, it seemed that perhaps the worst might be over. That illusion would not survive the decade. The Treaty of Versailles had attempted to solve a political problem, how to prevent German aggression through economic punishment. The result was to make economic recovery politically impossible, while ensuring that economic catastrophe would trigger political radicalization. The reparations question poisoned international relations throughout the 1920s and created the conditions for the Great Depression to become a political as well as economic catastrophe. Germany's reparations burden, fixed at 132 billion gold marks in 1921, was based less on careful economic calculation than on the domestic political needs of France and Belgium to show their voters that Germany would pay for the war's destruction. German economists immediately protested that such sums were impossible to transfer without permanently impoverishing the population. John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant British economist who had resigned from the British delegation at Versailles in disgust, wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace, arguing prophetically that the treaty's economic provisions would lead to disaster. The mechanism of reparations created a perverse dynamic. Germany was required to pay in gold or foreign currency, which it could obtain only by running a trade surplus. But if Germany succeeded in exporting enough to earn the necessary foreign exchange, it would undercut French and British industries, worsening unemployment in the victor nations. The Allies thus found themselves in the contradictory position of demanding payments while simultaneously trying to restrict German competition. The immediate post-war years brought hyperinflation that destroyed the German middle class and became seared into the national memory. The mark, which had traded at 4.2 to the dollar before the war, collapsed to 4.2 trillion to the dollar by November 1923. A loaf of bread that had cost 1 mark in 1918 cost 200 billion marks 5 years later. Life savings evaporated. Salaries became worthless between the time they were earned and the time they could be spent. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day so they could rush out to buy goods before prices rose further. People carted wheelbarrows full of currency to purchase basic necessities. The causes of this hyperinflation were complex: war debts, reparations, government budget deficits, and the decision to print money rather than raise taxes. But to ordinary Germans, the villains were clear: the Weimar government that printed the worthless currency and the foreign powers demanding impossible payments. The middle class, which had saved responsibly and patriotically purchased war bonds, was wiped out. Those with debt or physical assets survived. Those with savings and fixed incomes faced ruin. The psychological impact of hyperinflation cannot be overstated. It destroyed faith in the currency, in savings, in planning for the future, in the fundamental stability of civilization itself. An entire generation learned that money could become worthless, that governments could not be trusted, that the rules of the economic game could change overnight. This trauma would shape German behavior for decades. When Hitler later promised stability and order, millions who remembered the chaos of 1923 listened. France's occupation of the Ruhr in January 1923, ostensibly to enforce reparations payments after Germany defaulted, turned the crisis into a catastrophe. German workers in the Ruhr engaged in passive resistance, refusing to work for the occupiers. The German government, unable to collect taxes from the Ruhr, printed even more money to support the striking workers. French authorities responded with arrests, expulsions, and occasional violence. The occupation poisoned Franco-German relations and demonstrated that the victor powers would use force to maintain the Versailles system. The crisis ended only when Germany abandoned resistance, and when a new reparations plan, the Dawes Plan of 1924, restructured the payment schedule and arranged for American loans to stabilize the German currency. Charles Dawes, an American banker and future vice president, designed a system whereby American banks would lend money to Germany. Germany would use these loans to pay reparations to France and Britain, and France and Britain would use the reparations to repay their war debts to the United States. This circular flow of gold across the Atlantic created an illusion of solution. Germany received 25 billion marks in foreign loans between 1924 and 1930, mostly from American sources. The German economy recovered and even boomed. Berlin became a center of cultural experimentation and technological innovation. Reparations payments resumed. The French withdrew from the Ruhr. In 1925, the Locarno treaties seemed to herald a new era of cooperation between Germany and the Western powers. The Young Plan of 1929, named after American banker Owen Young, further reduced Germany's obligations and extended the payment period to 1988. It appeared that economic rationality was finally prevailing over nationalist emotion. The League of Nations admitted Germany. Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann, who had worked tirelessly for reconciliation, shared the Nobel Peace Prize. Perhaps the post-war era was truly ending, but this prosperity rested on a foundation of debt, American loans supporting German recovery, German reparations supporting Allied finances, Allied debt payments supporting American banks. The system functioned only as long as American money continued to flow. When that flow stopped, the entire structure would collapse. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, panic selling struck the New York Stock Exchange. Within days, the market had lost billions of dollars in value. The crash itself might have remained a financial event, painful but contained. Instead, it triggered a depression that spread worldwide and lasted a decade, reshaping politics, destroying democracies, and making war inevitable. The causes of the Great Depression remain debated by economists. The stock market bubble certainly contributed, as did agricultural overproduction, unequal income distribution, poor banking regulations, and misguided monetary policy. But the international transmission of the Depression was greatly facilitated by the war debt and reparations structure. When American banks recalled their loans to preserve capital, German businesses collapsed, unemployment soared, and Germany could no longer pay reparations. France and Britain, deprived of reparations, struggled to repay American debts. International trade, already hampered by post-war protectionism, shrank further as nations raised tariffs to protect domestic industries. The gold standard, which most nations had restored during the 1920s, spread the depression by forcing governments to maintain fixed exchange rates even as their economies contracted. When Britain abandoned gold in 1931, the shockwaves rippled through the international financial system. Banks failed in Austria, Germany, and the United States. The Bank of England, for 2 centuries the pillar of global finance, faced crisis. International capital flows, which had lubricated world trade, froze. The human cost was staggering. In Germany, unemployment reached 6 million, nearly one-third of the workforce by 1932. Industrial production fell by more than 40%. Wages plummeted for those fortunate enough to keep their jobs. Soup kitchens and bread lines became ubiquitous in cities. Young men who had never worked because no jobs existed wandered the streets. Farmers, unable to sell their produce at any price, watched crops rot in the fields. In the United States, unemployment reached 13 million. Banks failed by the thousands, wiping out depositors' savings. The Dust Bowl ravaged the agricultural heartland. Homeless encampments, Hoovervilles, sprang up in every major city. Britain, though less severely affected, saw unemployment above 20% and entire industrial regions reduced to destitution. The political consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Democracy depends on governments being able to deliver prosperity, or at least hope. When democratic governments proved incapable of ending the Depression, voters turned to extremists who promised radical solutions. The established parties, conservative, liberal, and social democratic, seemed to offer only austerity, patience, and adherence to failed economic orthodoxies. In Germany, the Nazi Party had won only 2.6% of the vote in 1928, when prosperity prevailed. In September 1930, with the Depression deepening, the Nazis won 18.3%, making them the second largest party. In July 1932, they won 37.3%, the largest party in the Reichstag. The Communist Party also grew dramatically, winning 14.5% in July 1932. The Democratic Centre was being crushed between two authoritarian movements, both contemptuous of parliamentary procedure, both prepared to use violence. The Nazi message resonated because it offered simple answers to complex problems: unemployment, the fault of Jewish finance capital and the Versailles system, economic depression, the result of reparations and weak democratic leadership, national humiliation, the consequence of the stab in the back. Hitler promised to make Germany great again, to repudiate Versailles, to restore German pride, to create jobs through rearmament and public works. His audiences, desperate and demoralized, heard what they wanted to hear. The conservative elites, who had always despised the Weimar Republic, now concluded that Hitler could be useful. True, he was crude and radical, but he commanded a mass movement. Perhaps he could be controlled, domesticated, made to serve traditional interests. The communists were the real threat. The Nazis were at least nationalists who respected property. This catastrophic miscalculation that Hitler could be manipulated by clever conservatives would doom Germany and Europe. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging war hero, appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor. Conservative politicians congratulated themselves on their cleverness. They had harnessed the Nazi movement to their own ends. Hitler's cabinet contained only 3 Nazis among 11 ministers. The traditional forces seemed securely in control. Within months, they discovered their error. Hitler moved with stunning speed to consolidate absolute power. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided a pretext for emergency decrees suspending civil liberties. The Enabling Act of March 1933 gave Hitler dictatorial powers. Political opponents were arrested, newspapers shut down, trade unions dissolved, opposition parties banned. By the summer of 1933, Germany had become a one-party state. The conservatives, who thought they were using Hitler, discovered that Hitler had used them. The economic crisis had destroyed German democracy because the economic system created by Versailles made Germany uniquely vulnerable. When the American loans stopped, the German recovery collapsed. When unemployment soared, voters turned to extremists. When democratic politicians failed to restore prosperity, they lost legitimacy. The Depression alone did not cause Hitler's rise, but without the Depression, the Nazi Party would have remained a fringe movement of fanatics. Across Europe, similar patterns emerged. In Austria, Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss established an authoritarian regime to prevent either Nazi or communist takeover, though he would be assassinated by Austrian Nazis in 1934, In Hungary and Poland, authoritarian leaders had already crushed democratic opposition. In Spain, political polarization would soon erupt into civil war. Even in France, anti-parliamentary leagues staged riots and threatened the Republic. The Depression did not merely destroy prosperity, it destroyed faith in the principles that had governed the Western world since the Enlightenment. Liberal capitalism, constitutional democracy, international cooperation, faith in progress. In Russia, Stalin pointed to the Depression as proof that capitalism was doomed and communism was the future. In Italy, Mussolini celebrated the superiority of fascist corporatism. In Germany, Hitler proclaimed that democracy had failed, and only authoritarian leadership could save the nation. The Western democracies, absorbed in their own economic crises, had neither the will nor the means to support democracy elsewhere. Britain and France, facing mass unemployment and political turmoil, could barely maintain their own systems. The United States, traumatized by the crash and mired in depression, retreated further into isolationism. The Soviet Union, undergoing forced industrialization and mass collectivization that caused millions of deaths, was consumed by internal convulsions. As the 1930s began, the international system created at Versailles lay in ruins. The reparations regime had collapsed, the Young Plan was abandoned. International trade had contracted by 2/3. The League of Nations had proven incapable of resolving economic crises or maintaining peace. Germany, no longer bound by the fiction of paying reparations, was free to pursue rearmament, and in Japan, military officers were plotting their own solution to economic distress: imperial expansion in Asia. The Depression had demonstrated that the post-war settlement was built on sand. When the economic foundation crumbled, everything else, security arrangements, diplomatic agreements, faith in collective security, collapsed with it. The road to the next war now lay open. The First World War had shattered more than empires and economies. It had broken something fundamental in the European psyche: faith in progress, in rationality, in the benevolent trajectory of human civilization. The 19th century had believed, with remarkable confidence, that humanity was advancing toward ever greater enlightenment, prosperity, and peace. The war destroyed that illusion in 4 years of mechanized slaughter. An entire generation of young men, the best educated, most idealistic, most promising, had been fed into the industrial meat grinder of the Western Front. The survivors returned home broken, not merely in body, but in spirit. They had witnessed horrors that pre-war civilization had considered impossible. They had seen men reduced to corpses by artillery, poison gas, machine guns. They had lived in mud and filth like animals. They had watched friends die screaming for their mothers. No language seemed adequate to describe what they had experienced. The literature that emerged from the trenches, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel, Siegfried Sassoon's poetry, Robert Graves's memoirs, conveyed not glory but grotesque futility. The old lies about dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, it is sweet and proper to die for one's country, had been exposed as obscene. War was not heroic adventure but industrialized butchery. Patriotism, honor, duty, all the values that had sent millions marching to their deaths seemed hollow, even criminal. This disillusionment created a generation that rejected the assumptions of their fathers. Some turned to pacifism, determined that never again would such slaughter be tolerated. Some turned to communism, believing that only revolutionary overthrow of capitalism could prevent future wars. Some turned to fascism, but almost all rejected liberal faith in gradual reform, rational discourse, and parliamentary compromise. Democracy itself seemed discredited. The war had been started by democratic governments, prosecuted by democratic parliaments, and sustained by democratic public opinion, whipped into hysterical nationalism. How could democracy be trusted if it had led to such catastrophe? The authoritarian regimes, especially the Soviet Union and later Nazi Germany, claimed to offer something better: unity of purpose, discipline, strength, a sense of collective mission that democracy supposedly could not provide. In Germany, this disillusionment was amplified by the conviction that the war had been lost not on the battlefield but through betrayal at home. The stab-in-the-back myth provided a psychologically comforting narrative. German soldiers had fought magnificently, German generals had devised brilliant strategies, but politicians and defeatists had sabotaged victory. This meant that German militarism had not failed. It had been denied its rightful triumph. Many German officers concluded that Germany had made one fundamental error. It had waged war while maintaining too much democracy at home. In the next war, there could be no freedom of speech to undermine morale, no political parties to divide the nation, no tolerance for dissent. Total war required total control. The Nazis would take this lesson to heart. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff had established a virtual military dictatorship in Germany during the war's final years, subordinating civilian government to military necessity. Though this system had failed to produce victory, it remained the ideal for many officers. They believed that if only such a system had been implemented earlier and maintained longer, Germany would have won. The problem was not authoritarianism, but insufficient authoritarianism. This militarist mindset persisted in the Reichswehr, the limited army permitted under Versailles. The Reichswehr, though small, became an elite force commanded almost entirely by officers who despised the republic they ostensibly served. General Hans von Seeckt, who led the Reichswehr from 1920 to 1926, maintained the army's traditional aloofness from civilian politics while secretly preparing for future rearmament. He collaborated with the Soviet Union, allowing German officers to train in tank and aircraft tactics in Russia, circumventing Versailles restrictions. The officer corps clung to the belief that military power was the ultimate arbiter of national greatness. The humiliation of 1918 could only be avenged through rearmament and war. The Treaty of Versailles was not a settlement to be accepted, but an injustice to be overthrown. Germany's military defeat was temporary. Its destiny was to dominate Europe. These attitudes, widespread in the military, ensured that when Hitler began to rearm Germany, he would face no opposition from the generals. The concept of Lebensraum, living space, predated Hitler but became central to Nazi ideology. The idea, propagated by geographer Friedrich Ratzel and popularized by Karl Haushofer, held that nations required territory proportional to their population and that competition for space was the fundamental law of history. Germany, surrounded by enemies and deprived of its colonies, supposedly faced suffocation. Only expansion eastward, conquering the agricultural lands of Poland and Ukraine, could secure Germany's future. This pseudo-scientific racism meshed perfectly with anti-Semitism to create Nazi ideology. Jews were cast as a parasitic race without territory, inherently international and thus opposed to healthy nationalism. The war to come would not be merely a conflict of nations, but a racial struggle for survival. The Bolshevik Revolution had provided an additional ideological dimension. To many Europeans, communism represented an existential threat to Western civilization. The Bolsheviks had not merely overthrown the Tsar, but had attempted to destroy all traditional structures: religion, property, family, nation. Their proclaimed goal of world revolution meant that no country was safe. Communist parties in every European nation took orders from Moscow and openly advocated violent overthrow of existing governments. This fear of communism became the great excuse for fascism. Traditional conservatives, church leaders, business owners, military officers, all could rally around anti-communism even if they found other aspects of fascism distasteful. The great slogan of the age became "Better Hitler than Stalin," a calculation that ignored the reality that Hitler and Stalin represented equally totalitarian. Stalin's Soviet Union reinforced these fears through its own actions. The forcible collectivization of agriculture between 1929 and 1933 caused a famine that killed millions, particularly in Ukraine. The Great Purges of 1936 to 1938 saw hundreds of thousands executed and millions more sent to the Gulag. Stalin's paranoia consumed even loyal communists. The old Bolsheviks who had made the revolution were tried in show trials and shot. The Red Army's officer corps was decimated by purges just when war was approaching. Yet despite these horrors, the Soviet Union attracted passionate support from Western intellectuals who saw it as humanity's great hope. The Depression had discredited capitalism, fascism was barbaric, only communism seemed to offer a rational path forward. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, volunteers from around the world joined the international brigades to fight fascism, seeing Spain as the crucial battleground between progress and reaction. Spain demonstrated how the ideological conflicts spawned by the Great War could tear a nation apart. When General Francisco Franco launched a military coup against the democratically elected Republican government, Germany and Italy supported the fascist rebels while the Soviet Union aided the Republicans. Britain and France, paralyzed by fear of a wider war, refused to intervene effectively. The war became a proving ground for German tanks and aircraft, a rehearsal for the larger conflict to come. The concept of total war, pioneered in 1914 to 1918, now included ideological warfare. Wars were no longer fought merely for territory or treasure, but for competing visions of human organization. Fascism, communism, and liberal democracy each claimed to represent the culmination of history, the final form of human society. Compromise between such absolute worldviews was impossible. One system must triumph, the others must be destroyed. This ideological absolutism made peace increasingly impossible. In 1914, the war had begun over relatively limited issues: Serbian independence, Balkan spheres of influence, naval competition. The combatants, despite the war's horror, had continued to observe many conventions of civilized warfare. In the coming war, no such limitations would apply. The conflict would be total, fought without mercy, aimed at complete subjugation or annihilation of the enemy. The technological advances made possible by the First World War now served even more destructive purposes. The tank, first used in 1916, had been developed into a decisive weapon of mobile warfare. The aircraft, which had begun as a reconnaissance tool, was now a strategic bomber capable of razing cities. Poison gas, though banned by the Geneva Protocol of 1925, remained in arsenals. Radio allowed instant communication and mass propaganda. The internal combustion engine enabled mechanized armies to move at unprecedented speeds. These technologies, combined with the ideological fanaticism of the 1930s, created the conditions for a new kind of war, faster, more destructive, more total than anything previously imagined. The First World War had been horrible, but it had been fought largely between professional armies according to established rules. The next war would deliberately target civilians, annihilate entire populations, and destroy the very fabric of civilization. Hitler understood this. His ambitions were not limited to revising Versailles or recovering lost territories. He envisioned the complete destruction of the Soviet Union. This was not hyperbole or propaganda. This was his genuine goal, clearly stated in Mein Kampf and in private conversations with his generals. The ideology of Nazism, it glorified struggle, celebrated violence, and viewed war as the highest expression of national vitality. A Germany that was not conquering was by definition decaying. War was inevitable because Nazi ideology required war. The veterans who had survived the trenches and vowed never again found themselves powerless against a younger generation that had not experienced the war's horror but had been radicalized by its consequences. The pacifism of the 1920s gave way to the militarism of the 1930s. The hope that collective security through the League of Nations could prevent future wars dissolved as each crisis revealed the League's impotence. Intellectuals and artists tried to warn of what was coming. Picasso's Guernica captured the horror of aerial bombardment. W. H. Auden wrote of low, dishonest decades. George Orwell fought in Spain and returned to warn that totalitarianism threatened to extinguish human freedom forever. But their warnings changed nothing. The forces leading to war were beyond the power of individuals to stop. The generation that had made the First World War, the politicians, generals, and diplomats who had stumbled into catastrophe in 1914, was dying off or retiring. The men rising to power in the 1930s were those who had experienced the war as junior officers or young soldiers. They had learned different lessons. They had learned that ruthlessness wins, that hesitation is weakness, that power respects only force. These were the men who would make the next war. By the mid-1930s, the question was no longer whether war would come, but when and how. The Versailles settlement had created the grievances. The Depression had provided the opportunity. The ideological conflicts of the post-war era ensured that the war would be fought without mercy. Now the stage was set for the final act. Hitler came to power with a clear agenda: rearmament, revision of Versailles, and preparation for war. Unlike the politicians who had preceded him, he was not interested in gradual change or negotiated settlements. He intended to overthrow the entire post-war order and establish German dominance over Europe. The remarkable fact is not that he attempted this, but that the democratic powers did almost nothing to stop him. Germany's rearmament began immediately and in flagrant violation of the Versailles Treaty. In March 1935, Hitler publicly announced that Germany was reintroducing conscription and building an army of 36 divisions, more than 3 times the permitted limit. France and Britain protested diplomatically, but took no action. The Versailles settlement, which had been enforced so brutally against Germany in the early 1920s, was now revealed as a paper tiger. The same month, Hermann Göring revealed the existence of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, explicitly forbidden by Versailles. Germany had secretly trained pilots in the Soviet Union and through civilian flying clubs, but now it openly flaunted its military aircraft. Britain responded not with force, but with negotiation, signing the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in June 1935 that allowed Germany to build a surface fleet up to 35% of British tonnage. This agreement marked a turning point. Britain had unilaterally amended the Treaty of Versailles without consulting France or the League of Nations. The message to Hitler was clear. The democratic powers would accept German rearmament if it proceeded gradually and if Germany offered reassuring diplomatic gestures. Hitler learned that he could violate treaties without consequence. In March 1936, Hitler ordered German troops to reoccupy the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone that served as a buffer between Germany and France. This was the most blatant violation yet. The Versailles Treaty, the Locarno Treaties of 1925, and all post-war security arrangements explicitly forbade German military presence in the Rhineland. If France had responded with force, as it was entitled to do under international law, the German army would have withdrawn. Hitler's own generals were nervous. Germany was not yet ready to fight France. But France did nothing. The government, divided by political turmoil and haunted by memories of the trenches, could not bring itself to act. Britain offered no support. British public opinion saw the Rhineland occupation as Germany simply walking into its own backyard. The moment passed. Hitler had gambled and won. He learned another crucial lesson. The Western democracies would not fight to enforce Versailles. This failure of will was not inevitable. It resulted from specific political decisions rooted in the trauma of the Great War. France had lost 1.3 million soldiers, proportionally the heaviest losses of any major power. An entire generation of young men had been decimated. The survivors were determined to avoid another war at almost any cost. French strategy relied on the Maginot Line, a massive system of fortifications along the German border, and on alliances with Eastern European countries to encircle Germany. But the Maginot Line exemplified defensive mentality. It was designed to prevent German invasion, not to project French power. When Hitler violated the Rhineland, France could not respond without mobilizing for offensive operations, psychologically and politically impossible. The alliances with Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania and Yugoslavia looked impressive on paper, but required French willingness to fight, which was increasingly doubtful. Britain's position was even more problematic. The British public, horrified by the slaughter of the Somme and Passchendaele, was passionately opposed to continental entanglements. The government, facing economic pressure to reduce military spending, had allowed the armed forces to deteriorate. The Royal Navy remained powerful, but the British Army was a small professional force unsuited for continental warfare. The Royal Air Force was being rebuilt, but strategic bombing doctrine was unproven. More fundamentally, many in Britain believed that Germany had legitimate grievances. The Versailles Treaty had been too harsh. German resentment was understandable. Perhaps Germany should be allowed to recover its natural position in Europe. This sympathy for German revisionism made it difficult to oppose Hitler's early moves, which could be portrayed as simply correcting the excesses of Versailles. The policy that emerged from these attitudes became known as appeasement. The term later became synonymous with cowardice and moral failure, but in the mid-1930s it seemed to many like wisdom. The alternative to appeasement was war, and war was unthinkable. If Germany could be satisfied through negotiation, if Hitler's demands were limited and reasonable, then peace could be preserved. This was the great delusion of the era. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who took office in 1937, was appeasement's most committed advocate. A capable administrator and former businessman, Chamberlain believed that international disputes could be resolved through rational negotiation. He saw Hitler as a German nationalist who, like any leader, could be appeased through reasonable concessions. What Chamberlain failed to understand was that Hitler was not interested in reasonable settlements. His goals were unlimited. The Spanish Civil War, which raged from 1936 to 1939, demonstrated the Western democracy's paralysis. Germany and Italy openly supported Franco's fascist rebels with troops, aircraft, and equipment. The Soviet Union aided the Republicans, though less generously. France and Britain, officially neutral, enforced a non-intervention agreement that effectively embargoed the legitimate Republican government while doing nothing to stop German and Italian intervention. The war became a testing ground for German tactics and equipment. The Condor Legion, German pilots flying German aircraft, perfected dive-bombing techniques and terror bombing of civilian targets. The destruction of Guernica in April 1937 shocked the world but changed nothing. When Franco finally triumphed in March 1939, fascism had won another victory, and Germany had learned that the democracies would not fight even when their interests were clearly threatened. Austria was next. Hitler, himself Austrian by birth, had always intended to unite Austria and Germany in a greater German Reich. In March 1938, after engineering a crisis through the Austrian Nazi Party, Hitler issued an ultimatum: accept German troops or face invasion. Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg resigned. German forces crossed the border unopposed on March 12th. The Anschluss, annexation, was complete within days. Technically, this violated the Treaty of Versailles, which explicitly forbade Austro-German union. Practically, it was a fait accompli. Austria had a large Nazi party that welcomed Hitler enthusiastically. Many Austrians genuinely desired union with Germany. Britain and France protested but did nothing. The League of Nations, which was supposed to preserve small nations' independence, was not even consulted. With Austria absorbed, Hitler turned to Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland, the border regions of Czechoslovakia inhabited primarily by ethnic Germans, became Hitler's next target. He claimed that these Germans were oppressed by the Czech government and required protection. The real goal was to destroy Czechoslovakia, which had alliances with France and the Soviet Union, and whose well-equipped army and formidable border fortifications represented the strongest barrier to German expansion eastward. The Sudeten crisis dominated the summer and autumn of 1938. Hitler threatened war if the Sudetenland were not ceded to Germany. France had a treaty obligation to defend Czechoslovakia, but desperately sought to avoid war. Britain, not bound by treaty, but fearful of being drawn into conflict, attempted to mediate. Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times to negotiate with Hitler. The crisis culminated in the Munich Conference of September 29th to 30th, 1938. Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and French Premier Édouard Daladier met to decide Czechoslovakia's fate. The Czechs themselves were not invited. The Soviets, though allied to Czechoslovakia, were excluded. In the early hours of September 30th, the four leaders agreed the Sudetenland would be ceded to Germany, and Germany would guarantee Czechoslovakia's remaining territory. Chamberlain returned to London to cheering crowds, waving the agreement and proclaiming peace for our time. Daladier, expecting condemnation, was also greeted as a hero. The general European relief was profound. War had been averted. Surely Hitler would now be satisfied. Within 6 months, Hitler violated the Munich Agreement by occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, German troops entered Prague unopposed. Bohemia and Moravia became German protectorates. Slovakia became a puppet state. The supposedly independent and secure Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. Chamberlain's guarantees proved worthless. Munich represented the final failure of appeasement and the complete collapse of the Versailles system. France had abandoned its alliance commitments. Britain had sacrificed a democratic ally to avoid war. The Soviet Union concluded that the Western powers were unreliable, and perhaps even hoped to direct German aggression eastward. The smaller nations of Eastern Europe realized they could not count on Western support. Hitler learned that he could break agreements without consequence. The psychology of appeasement deserves understanding, not merely condemnation. The democratic leaders who pursued it were not fools or cowards. They were men haunted by the trenches, desperate to avoid another Somme, convinced that any negotiated peace was better than war. The fundamental error was assuming that Hitler was a traditional statesman pursuing limited national goals. If Germany wanted to revise certain aspects of Versailles, recover the Rhineland, unite with Austria, protect German minorities, these might be achieved through diplomacy. But Hitler did not want revision, he wanted revolution. He did not seek Germany's rightful place in a European balance of power. He sought German domination of a racially reorganized Europe. No amount of concessions could satisfy him because his ambitions were limitless. Even after Prague, some hoped that Hitler might stop. Perhaps he would consolidate his gains. Perhaps the Reich's expansion had natural limits. This hope died in the summer of 1939 when Hitler turned to Poland. His demands, the return of Danzig to Germany and an extraterritorial highway across the Polish corridor, seemed negotiable. But Hitler did not want negotiation. He wanted war. The Danzig corridor emerged from the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, carved from former German territory to give newly independent Poland access to the Baltic Sea. This created one of interwar Europe's most contentious borders. The free city of Danzig, today's Gdansk, became a semi-autonomous city-state under League of Nations protection, while the corridor itself physically separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. For Germans, this represented a daily reminder of their defeat in World War I. For Poland, it meant economic survival through maritime trade. The region's population was ethnically mixed, with census data fiercely disputed by both sides. Polish sources claimed a Polish majority in the corridor, while German statistics emphasized the German character of cities like Danzig, which was indeed 95% German-speaking. This demographic complexity created genuine tensions at the local level, with both communities feeling threatened by the other's national aspirations. In January 1934, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Poland. For nearly 5 years, German-Polish relations were stable. Trade increased, diplomatic visits occurred, and both nations cooperated against what they saw as the Soviet threat. Polish Marshal Piłsudski even considered Hitler less dangerous than Stalin. Some historians argue Poland missed opportunities to ally with France and Czechoslovakia against Germany during this period, instead maintaining its non-alignment policy. In October 1938, Germany presented Poland with demands: return Danzig to the Reich, allow an extraterritorial highway and railway through the corridor, and join the anti-Comintern Pact against the Soviet Union. Poland's foreign minister Beck refused, understanding that accepting would make Poland a German satellite state. When Britain guaranteed Polish independence in March 1939, Hitler was reportedly furious, ordering his generals to prepare for war. Throughout spring and summer 1939, German propaganda intensified its focus on Polish atrocities against ethnic Germans. There were indeed some incidents of discrimination and ethnic tension as existed throughout Eastern Europe's mixed regions. Polish authorities, fearing fifth column activities, did crack down on some German organizations. However, propaganda transformed isolated incidents into a systematic campaign of persecution that historians say didn't match historical reality, but that's up to you to decide. As August 1939 ended, border tensions reached a breaking point. German propaganda claimed massive Polish persecution, though international observers found these claims vastly exaggerated. The most significant violence actually occurred after Germany invaded on September 1st. In Bydgoszcz on September 3rd, retreating Polish forces and civilians killed several hundred ethnic Germans suspected of sabotage, what Germans called Bloody Sunday. Britain and France, finally understanding that appeasement had failed, guaranteed Polish independence. If Germany attacked Poland, they would fight. Hitler, contemptuous of their warnings after years of retreat, did not believe them. Besides, he had secured his Eastern Front through the most cynical diplomatic maneuver of the era, the Nazi-Soviet Pact. On August 23, 1939, Foreign Ministers Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov signed a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The two totalitarian states, ostensibly bitter enemies, agreed not to attack each other. Secret protocols divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany would take Western Poland, the Soviet Union would take Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. The pact shocked the world. Communist parties globally, which had spent years denouncing fascism, now had to defend cooperation with Hitler. Democratic nations saw it as proof of totalitarian cynicism. But the pact was logical for both sides. Hitler eliminated the threat of a two-front war, freeing him to attack Poland and then, if necessary, fight France and Britain. Stalin bought time to prepare for what he knew would be Germany's eventual betrayal, while seizing territory to create a buffer zone. At dawn, on September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. The Wehrmacht demonstrated a new kind of warfare, Blitzkrieg, lightning war, that combined tanks, aircraft and motorized infantry in coordinated assaults that shattered Polish defences. Britain and France, honour-bound by their guarantee, declared war on September 3rd. The Second World War had begun, but this was not a new war. It was the continuation of the war that had supposedly ended in November 1918. The territorial disputes, ideological conflicts, and national resentments that exploded in 1939 had been created by the First World War and the flawed peace that followed. The two world wars were one 30-year conflict with a 20-year armistice. And faced starvation, unemployment soared. The democratic government, associated with economic failure and apparent weakness toward Western powers, lost legitimacy. The military, which had always held special status in Japanese politics, increasingly viewed civilian politicians with contempt. Young army officers, radicalized by economic crisis and resentful of Japan's subordinate international position, began plotting direct action. In 1931, officers of the Kwantung Army, Japan's force in Manchuria, staged a false flag incident near Mukden and used it as pretext to conquer Manchuria. The civilian government in Tokyo, presented with a fait accompli, eventually endorsed the conquest. Manchuria became the puppet state of Manchukuo, providing Japan with resources and territory. The League of Nations condemned Japan's aggression. Japan responded by withdrawing from the League in 1933. The same year Hitler came to power and also withdrew Germany from the League. The two revisionist powers, though geographically distant, were beginning to recognize their common interest in destroying the post-war order. The military's success in Manchuria emboldened further aggression. In 1937, a clash between Japanese and Chinese troops near Beijing escalated into full-scale war. Japanese forces captured Shanghai after brutal fighting, then advanced on the Chinese capital of Nanjing. The Nanjing massacre, weeks of mass murder, rape, and destruction, revealed the savagery that Japanese militarism had unleashed. The war in China became a quagmire. Nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek and communist forces under Mao Zedong both resisted, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes cooperating against Japan. The vast distances of China absorbed Japan's military strength. American sympathy for China, expressed through economic aid and moral condemnation of Japan, pushed the two Pacific powers toward confrontation. Japan's expansion was driven by the same logic that drove Germany's: belief that a nation required resources and territory to survive, that international law was a hypocritical device by which dominant powers maintained their advantage, and that military strength was the ultimate arbiter of international relations. The concept of a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, Japan's rhetorical justification for empire, was the Asian equivalent of Lebensraum, a pseudo-ideological cover for naked aggression. The Japanese military studied German tactics and admired Nazi Germany's willingness to defy the Western powers. When Hitler proposed the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936, ostensibly an alliance against communism, but really an alignment of revisionist powers, Japan joined immediately, followed by Italy. The Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis was taking shape, uniting three militaristic, authoritarian regimes determined to overthrow the post-war settlement. In Europe, Italy's trajectory paralleled Germany's and Japan's. Mussolini, the first of the fascist dictators, dreamed of reviving Roman imperial glory. His rhetoric about Mare Nostrum, our sea, referring to the Mediterranean, and about Italy's civilizing mission in Africa mimicked the pseudo-historical justifications all fascist regimes employed. In 1935, Mussolini ordered the invasion of Ethiopia, one of Africa's few remaining independent states. The Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie appealed to the League of Nations, delivering a prophetic speech warning that if the League failed to stop Italian aggression, no small nation would be safe. The League imposed half-hearted sanctions that deliberately excluded oil, the one commodity that might have crippled Italy's war effort. Britain and France, unwilling to risk war with Italy, effectively allowed the conquest to proceed. Ethiopian resistance was brave but futile. Italian forces used poison gas and aerial bombardment against poorly armed opponents. By May 1936, Ethiopia had been conquered and annexed to Italian East Africa. Mussolini had his empire, the League had failed another test, and collective security was revealed as a fiction. The Ethiopian crisis pushed Italy closer to Germany. Mussolini had initially opposed Nazi expansionism, even mobilizing troops on the Austrian border in 1934 to prevent Anschluss, but sanctions alienated Italy from the Western powers, while Hitler offered friendship and support. By 1936, Mussolini was proclaiming the Rome-Berlin Axis. The alliance of fascist states, united by contempt for democracy and commitment to expansion, was solidifying. The Soviet Union occupied a unique position. Excluded from Versailles and ostracized as a revolutionary pariah state, the USSR had its own reasons to oppose the post-war order. Stalin's rise to absolute power after Lenin's death had transformed Bolshevism from revolutionary ideology into paranoid tyranny. The forced collectivization of agriculture and breakneck industrialization killed millions but created military-industrial capacity. Stalin viewed Nazi Germany as both ideological enemy and potential threat. Soviet military doctrine assumed eventual war with Germany, but Stalin also distrusted Britain and France, whom he suspected of hoping to provoke a Nazi-Soviet war that would exhaust both totalitarian regimes. His massive military purges of 1937 to 1938, in which tens of thousands of Red Army officers were executed, critically weakened Soviet defenses just when war approached. The Spanish Civil War demonstrated Soviet fascist rivalry. Stalin sent weapons, advisors, and NKVD agents to support the Republicans, not from idealism, but from calculation that a fascist Spain would threaten Soviet interests. The war became a proxy conflict between fascism and communism, with democracy caught between them. When Franco won with German and Italian support, the balance of power shifted further toward fascism. Stalin's decision to sign the non-aggression pact with Hitler in August 1939 was cynical but rational. The Western powers' appeasement convinced him they were weak and unreliable. The Munich Agreement, excluding Soviet participation despite Soviet alliances with Czechoslovakia, seemed proof that Britain and France hoped to direct German expansion eastward. Better to buy time, seize territory in Eastern Europe, and prepare for the inevitable war while Germany fought the Western powers. The Middle East, carved up by Britain and France after the Ottoman Empire's collapse, provided another arena where Great War consequences festered. The mandate system, whereby former Ottoman territories were placed under British or French guidance, was imperialism barely disguised as international trusteeship. Arab nationalism, which the British had encouraged during the war through figures like T.E. Lawrence, felt betrayed by post-war settlements that divided the Arab world into artificial states. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, promising British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, collided with promises made to Arabs, creating a conflict that would haunt the region for generations. Jewish immigration to Palestine, driven by persecution in Europe and Zionist ideology, accelerated as anti-Semitism intensified in Nazi Germany. Arab resistance to this immigration grew violent. British attempts to limit Jewish immigration, as in the White Paper of 1939, alienated Zionists while failing to satisfy Arabs. The 1920s had seen revolts against Western control across the Middle East, in Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. The Great Depression and the rise of fascism radicalized politics further. Arab nationalists, though opposed to colonialism, sometimes expressed sympathy for fascist movements that also opposed Britain and France. The intricate tensions created by the First World War's end would not explode into full crisis until after the Second World War, but they were already present. In Africa, the Italian conquest of Ethiopia demonstrated that colonialism's supposedly civilizing mission was merely violence dressed in rhetoric. Across the continent, colonized peoples watched as European powers that claimed superiority and legitimacy through international law brutally suppressed resistance while preaching about democracy and self-determination. The hypocrisy was glaring. Latin America, though geographically distant from the trenches, was economically devastated by the Depression. Authoritarian governments, often military dictatorships, became common as democracy collapsed under economic pressure. The United States, dominant in the hemisphere, pursued its good neighbor policy of reduced intervention, but American economic power still shaped the region's development. The fundamental pattern was global. The First World War and its aftermath had destroyed the old imperial order without creating a stable replacement. Nationalism, unleashed by Wilson's rhetoric about self-determination, but betrayed by the great powers' actual behavior, spread everywhere. Colonies and semi-colonies demanded independence. Revisionist powers rejected the settlement imposed on them. Economic crisis discredited democracy and empowered extremists. The League of Nations, which was supposed to manage this transition peacefully, failed at every test. When Japan invaded Manchuria, the League condemned but did not act. When Italy invaded Ethiopia, the League imposed ineffective sanctions. When Germany rearmed and remilitarized the Rhineland, the League was ignored. The League had no mechanism to enforce its decisions because it relied on the willingness of powerful states to accept international law, and the powerful states were either revisionist powers determined to overthrow the system or status quo powers unwilling to fight to defend it. International law itself became a casualty. Treaties were broken without consequence. Borders were violated with impunity. Aggression was rewarded while restraint was exploited as weakness. The world was returning to a Hobbesian state of nature where might made right and no authority existed above the nation-state. By 1939, the entire post-war order had collapsed. In Europe, Germany had destroyed the Versailles settlement through a combination of rearmament, territorial expansion, and diplomatic manipulation. In Asia, Japan had created a vast empire through brutal conquest. In Africa, Italy had defied the League and seized territory. The Soviet Union, pursuing its own agenda, had collaborated with both fascist powers and capitalist democracies as expedient. The democratic powers, Britain, France, and the United States, had proven incapable of defending the system they created. Britain, exhausted and overextended, could not simultaneously defend its European interests, its empire, and its global trade. France, traumatized by the Great War, could not summon the will to enforce Versailles when doing so might provoke another war. The United States, having rejected the League and retreated into isolationism, absented itself from responsibility until forced back by attack. The world was fragmenting into hostile camps, fascist totalitarians, communist totalitarians, and embattled democracies. Between them lay smaller powers desperately trying to survive through neutrality, alliance shifts, or appeasement. The international system had become a jungle where the strong preyed on the weak and where predators were beginning to eye each other. When Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, he was not merely attacking a neighbour, he was launching an assault on the entire structure of international relations built after 1918. And because that structure was already so thoroughly compromised, his assault would succeed beyond his initial expectations. The war that began in 1939 would truly become a world war, fought on every continent, consuming more than 60 million lives, and reshaping human civilization more profoundly than any previous conflict. But its origins lay in the unresolved conflicts of 1914 to 1918. And that brings this video to a close. I hope you found it interesting and learned something new. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and I appreciate every one of you who supports the work I do here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, and goodbye for now.